And begin when ready.
So I did my presentation on IQ and its correlation to success. In my preliminary research, I found a lot of debate about whether there's a relation and what the relation is. So I found very credible sources talking about how if someone has a high IQ, they're going to be more likely to be successful, and I found very credible sources saying the exact opposite. And in my paper, I defined success as a mix of mental happiness and good mental health, as well as job satisfaction and income. And so I found sources kind of all over the place, and that made me curious as to what I could find when I did research, and that's why I chose to try and pinpoint how IQ can predict one's future income and mental health. Which leads me to my topic question, which is IQ an accurate predictor for success? So key terms that we should know going into this presentation are EQ, emotional intelligence, and IQ, your intelligence quotient. Both of these are standardized tests that you can take online, and they measure both your EQ would be your emotional intelligence and your IQ, your intelligence quotient. Both are standard tests that can be taken for free online. So I hypothesized that the higher your IQ, the higher your average income would be. However, also you would be more likely to experience stress, anxiety, and overthinking, as opposed to someone with a lower IQ who would be more prone to more severe mental health issues like depression, suicidal thoughts, and self-harm, as well as most likely having a lower income. The importance of this study is that if my hypotheses were to be proven correct, you could identify flaws and strengths and play to them. So for example, if you're someone with a high IQ and you find out that you're more likely to overthink or to stress about little things, you can now be cognizant of that and try and combat it. And on the opposite side, if you see that someone with a high IQ is more likely to succeed in a math field professionally, you can now play to that strength and take more math classes and try to amplify those. My method of inquiry, so I sent the survey out to 500 participants of all races, genders, and ages 17 and up. And it included a short mental health survey that was just 10 questions, and an IQ test was linked at the end that took about 25 to 35 minutes to complete. It was ranked the most accurate free IQ test, so that is why I chose that one. And all the participants remained anonymous. So here are my results. As you can see, the graph is all over the place, and the R-squared score is 0.005. As you know, probably the closer to 1 R-squared score is, the more correlation the two have. So there's basically no correlation between my two variables. And the blue dots are the participants. And then I want to dive into on the next slide how I scored this so you can understand what this means more. So 60 individuals were participated in my study, which was a little bit disappointing considering I sent it out to 500 people. And as we said, there was no correlation found between one's IQ and mental health. I also wanted to highlight, I didn't pull the second part of the definition I had for success, which was job, income, and satisfaction, mainly because that it would have been really hard to actually scale that, as I had 17-year-olds participating who probably don't work or work in a restaurant or at a department store, all the way up to, you know, grandparents who are retired and everything in between. So that would have been really hard, not to mention I felt it would have been kind of inappropriate to ask someone's salary on my Google form. But so I focused mainly on the mental health aspect in my research, and I came to the conclusion that it's based mostly on other things, and it's not simple enough to just say, oh, you have a high IQ score, you are more likely to have better or worse mental health, and rather it is more based on your coping mechanisms, your emotional awareness, your support systems, and all of these factor into your EQ. And on my survey, each question was ranked 0 to 4, so I had almost always, often, sometimes, rarely, and never as the choices. Never would be 0, and almost always would be 4. There were a couple exceptions to this. So I had 2 questions. One of them was a yes or no. Have you thought about or committed self-harm? And that was, a no was a 0, and a yes was a 3. And another question in regards to how much sleep my participants got per night. So it was 6 to 7 hours, 7 to 8 hours, 8 to 9, etc. And that one I ended up disregarding completely, and it wasn't included in my research. And this is because while getting 6 hours of sleep a night you're likely not mentally healthy. Also, if you're getting 13 hours of sleep tonight, that's probably not healthy. So it was very hard to scale because of that, and not to mention, especially with the different ages included in my study, I might need 6 hours of sleep a night to function, 7 hours of sleep, as opposed to someone else who might need 10. So it was pretty hard to scale accurately, and for that reason I just scrapped it completely. And the total mental health score was out of 39. The higher your mental health, or the higher your score, the worse your mental health is, and vice versa. So if you had 39, which no one did, thankfully, in my study, that would be a serious problem. And if you had a 0, again, which no one did, then you've never had a mental health problem in your life, which is unlikely. Some limitations of my study, and number one is the most serious, in my opinion, is that some people didn't take the IQ test seriously. As I mentioned before, it's a 25 to 35 minute commitment to sit down and take this test, and a lot of people didn't want to do that. And I think if they did, they might have started out giving it their full effort, and 15 minutes in, gotten bored, and realized that this test isn't mandatory and it's not graded, and started, kind of giving it a half effort or just clicking random buttons. And I'm fearful that that severely impacted the accuracy of my study. And that kind of feeds into the low number of participants as well. I think some people gave it a shot and tried to go and participate and ended up, giving it a half effort. And some people didn't even do that and just decided they didn't want to take it because it was completely voluntary. And then, as I mentioned before, the question regarding sleep was unusable. If someone were to expand on my research in the future, I would recommend that they administer the test in person. This way I feel like it would create an environment where people could be more focused and locked in on the test that they're taking. And if the administrator wanted to, they could even reward participants for scoring higher on the IQ test. And this way it would encourage participants to study, or not study, but lock in and focus and give it their best effort. And then I'd also say to gather a larger sample size and diversify the sample size. And what I mean by this is I had a diverse sample size, right? I had multiple races, genders, ages, but there were still areas of the population that unfortunately I wasn't able to include in my study. So I talked with a former doctor at VCU who now works at a hospital in California and deals with a lot of mentally ill patients. And something that we talked about, which was really interesting, is that homeless people is a portion of the population that she works with often. And she feels like a lot of these people did at one point have really high IQs, and they were very smart individuals. And they were prone to a lot of these things that we mentioned earlier in my hypothesis, like overthinking and stressing. And they just had so much going on in their mind that they couldn't deal with it. And a lot of them resorted to drugs or other things that would kind of calm these thoughts, but in return, it would lower their IQ. So I think that is a really interesting part of the population that I wasn't able to include in my study. And if another person were to continue on it, I would recommend to try and get a more diverse sample size. That's all I have. These are my sources on this slide and the next.
Thank you very much. We have 11 minutes for the panel, remaining for the 20 minutes for the questions.
Well, you have the first group, right? I mean, if none of it makes any difference, which one are we going?
As long as we get all three.
All right, Avi, how did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
Right, I think that, like I said, the biggest limitation that was my concern was that people weren't taking it seriously. And also, I think there was probably some sort of skew in just the people that volunteered to take it as opposed to people that didn't. I wonder if people that volunteered tended to be more academic and therefore maybe had a higher IQ. So it's not as much with my limitations, I feel like, that they impacted my understanding of my study, but more how to conduct research in general, which I feel like might have actually been the more valuable skill to learn. Because, like I said, in the future, it would impact, like, as I want to administer the test in person, maybe reward individuals who scored higher, and just conduct the research in a more thorough way to make sure that individuals are really giving it their full effort and trying to get the highest score that they can in order to provide the most accurate results in my study.
Same follow-up question?
Follow-ups are saved till the end.
Okay, Avi, thinking back to the initial curiosity that sparked this particular inquiry, what other curiosities do you have about this topic? And how has this process prepared you to explore them?
I'm really interested as to whether or not IQ is still an accurate measurement of one's intelligence, or if it's outdated. I didn't really get to do that much research on it, and it's not really in my paper. Some of it was more just for fun because I was curious. But like I said, a lot of times people have high IQs, and it's too much for them, and they do things that kind of bring them down. And that is really interesting to me, as well as, you know, where you grow up probably affects your IQ. Can you afford to be sent to a nice preschool, a nice elementary school, middle school, etc.? Or, you know, are you in a public school system that's good? Are you in a public school system that's bad? And all these things have such a effect on your IQ that I still wonder if it is the most effective way of measuring one's base level of intelligence.
Right, so my question is, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
I think that the most important results were ideally what would be on this chart. However, it was frustrating. I spent a lot of time compiling the data, and I looked at the chart, and I kind of had an oh crap moment where I realized that none of it relates. And like I said, I want to think that a lot of that is because the way the study was conducted. I still think that there is a high chance that these two correlate in some way, even if it's not as simple as just, you know, low IQ, you're going to have this, high IQ, you're going to have that. So it's kind of hard to say because my study didn't correlate, but I still think that if the study was conducted more thoroughly with more resources, that the hypothesis that I had of what not just whether you're more or less likely to have a mental health illness, but what kind of mental illness you are more likely to have would have been the most interesting to me.
Can I follow up?
And we now have 7 minutes for any follow-ups from the panel.
So knowing all of those challenges that you have, how did you ensure the reliability and the validity of all of these results from your paper?
Can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
How did you ensure the reliability and validity of your results?
Right. I think that that is the biggest limitation I actually had, which is that it couldn't be insured because I wasn't with the participants while they were taking the test. So for example, if I send it out to someone, it's on their own time whenever they want to that they would take this test and I'm not with them. And not only that, but it's anonymous. So I know the people I send it out to, but I don't know whose test is who. It could be any of the 5 people I sent it out to, so I can't even have a follow-up question with you about, you know, how attentive you were during the exam. So I think that was actually the biggest flaw in my entire research, was that I couldn't ensure the authenticity of the results. Any other follow-ups?
In response to my question, you speculated that the people who actually managed to follow through and take the test, that they might have higher IQs. I mean, can you think of any other explanation for why they would have done it and other people didn't?
I think there were definitely, a lot of explanations, and I think that some of them wouldn't really have to do with my paper. For example, if you're my parents, you're gonna take the exam because you're close to me and you feel like you should help out, and I don't think that has anything to do with, you know, how close I am to you as a person and your likelihood of having a high or low IQ. I don't think that would have any impact on the study. But I think that the biggest is motivation. If that's something you want to do, you really want to see the results of this study, the likelihood that you're more academically driven is, those probably relate. That's, in my opinion, the biggest thing. But I'm sure there were other factors, but that's the one that was my biggest concern.
There's a little bit of a leading question, because the thing that got me thinking when you said that was conscientiousness. And I really wonder if conscientiousness actually tracks with success more than IQ. You know, and it's also a much narrower measure too. Like, I mean, IQ is a notoriously complex construct, and it's got so many parts. You know, and harder to get at, but I think conscientiousness is a more specific kind of personality trait that actually might correlate with success, I think. But
Yeah, 100%. If you're present enough to take the exam and you're aware enough just to do it without any reward or compensation, you probably are more driven. And
yeah, you're the sort
that's
of
a good
person who
point.
says, I'm going to take this test, and then you actually do it, right? Because talk is cheap, as they say, and
Yeah.
who actually do it.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Your original hypothesis was that people with higher IQ might have higher money, but they also have higher stress. And you also hypothesized that perhaps people with the lower IQs would have even more mental stress and wellness issues. Did you have any part of a hypothesis for anyone who might be low stress?
Yeah, I think that
Make any
people.
guesses?
My hypothesis, I think people with lower IQ would stress less, but I think that they would still be more prone to other mental illnesses, just not, stress, anxiety, but more severe, such as, like I mentioned, depression, suicidal thoughts, etc. I think everyone's going to stress and everyone's going to have anxiety. I think that is a part of being a human, in a sort, but I think that my thought was that people with higher IQ would stress more, partially because they had more income and because they probably had a more qualified, more higher up job, and I think a lot of stress comes with that, as well as the higher your IQ, the more thoughts you have running around your mind constantly, and it's very hard, or it can be, to balance those out and sort between the negative and positive thoughts that impact and create stress. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions from the panel?
So since you're telling us that there's no correlation based on this graph, I am actually concerned what type of statistical treatment did you use? Because maybe you're just using the wrong statistical treatment. And if you have the correct statistical treatment, it may actually give you another graph showing the relationship between IQ and mental health. So what type of statistical treatment tool did you use to come up with this one?
Yeah, so like in my survey, I sent out 10 mental health questions, which were pretty standard. Like if you've gotten a form in a doctor's office regarding your mental health, it was just kind of the questions you would see on there. And then the IQ exam that was found online. And so on this graph, I had the blue dots are the participants, and I looked at it in a couple different ways and a couple different types of graphs. This is the one that made the most sense in my mind, so that's why it's up there. But in none of them did I find anything that resembled a correlation. And like I said, I don't believe that that means 100% there is no correlation, because my sample size was so small and there were limitations. I think there's a very high likelihood that the two still do correlate in some manner. It's just that in my study, I wasn't able to prove that with a high enough confidence rate to proclaim there is or there isn't a correlation.
Gotcha. So these are raw data of your participants.
Yes, this is the raw data of the
Okay.
participants.
Because I'm thinking you should have done a statistical treatment. That way you can see the correlation between mental health and IQ.
Right.
Maybe for the future studies.
Yeah.
Any further questions from the panel? We have about 1 minute left.
So I'm curious to know what you probably learned a lot of things about statistics in the course of doing this, but I'm wondering, what are the most important things that you learned that would be useful to future AP research students?
Yeah, so luckily I'm taking AP statistics this semester. If you weren't, I feel kind of bad because it was incredibly helpful. But I think conducting research and just how to conduct research was the #1 thing that I learned, between just the biases that you can encounter, and honestly less the math part and actually analyzing the data was what I learned, and it was more on the side of how to conduct the research properly with the least amount of limitations possible. And part of that was a trial and error, and I learned that in this, but I'm excited to be able to use the things that I learned from both the positive and negative and bring it with me in the future.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation.